This is Langston Hughes. I have him kind of in a younger picture on the bottom right, and on the upper left, a kind of older Langston Hughes. He was born in 1902 and died in 1967. So in many ways, he's kind of born at the turn of the 20th century and comes of age during the World War I. He dies at kind of the end of the civil rights movement that's kind of moving into a Black Power movement and the Black arts movement. And the Black arts movement in particular was a movement that was very much more radical and also even masculinist in a lot of ways, really very focused on kind of reclaiming Black manhood. In many ways, it saw itself kind of answering against some of the more conservative strains of the Harlem Renaissance, right? But the Harlem Renaissance in itself is kind of a very, there was a lot of different types of artists who had very different types of views, right? And so while we're giving you Langston Hughes, you could look at many other people, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, to get very different senses of what the Harlem Renaissance was, right? But the thing is that Langston Hughes was prolifically writing and basically writing until his death. And so we have so much material for him. Oh, and I meant to bring my book in here, but I have his complete poetry, and it's like a book like this thick, right? And because he has so much we can talk about. So Langston Hughes was born and raised in the Midwest, though he's really often known for the fact that he lived most of his life in Harlem, and that he was kind of he was like a Harlem, that he was like the guy who really tried to represent what Harlem looked like and what Harlem felt like. And especially after the Great Migration, in which many Black Americans from the South moved north, hoping to be able to find opportunity and really also to escape the type of violence and racial discrimination of the South. Clearly, they didn't get to escape all of it, but there was thought that there'd be more opportunity, right? And so Harlem became kind of this changing demographic that was moving more towards more Black neighborhoods, right? Like I said, he's a prolific writer. He first is published at the age of 19, which I always am like, man, like this guy's like in college and he's already publishing. And The Negro Speaks of Rivers is a really well-known poem and a beautiful poem to teach if you ever want to. It's really gorgeous for thinking about imagery. His finances were dependent on patrons, and I like to talk to my students about this because we don't often think about the fact that for a long time, patronage was really what drove a lot of the arts. And in the Harlem Renaissance, there were many artists with patrons. Patrons kind of were upper class people who would support artists. When he wasn't being patronized, right, by these, patronized, you know what I mean, like being paid for to write, he also was writing for survival. If you read a lot of his work, some of his work is not that great, but it was done so that he could make money to live, right? He wanted to live as a writer, and so he did. He couldn't get the same money or prestige of white writers, right? He wasn't paid the same amount. He couldn't be published in some of the same types of publications because it wasn't as easy to do so. There's a poem called Poet to Patron. That's a short poem, but it can be really nice to show students about kind of what it felt like to be paid to write poetry, the kind of pressure that puts onto you. And so he did feel like he was kind of always, there was a lot of pressure under him to write, especially when he was working under a patron. I do like put like there, if you are teaching about Langston Hughes, the kind of top 3 things you need to know and that you should kind of give to your students is that he's basically the face of the Harlem Renaissance for many people. And that just one of the most well-known artists. But he's also like a Renaissance man, that he wrote not only poetry, though that's often what we think about him. He wrote plays, dramas, serial writing, novelists. He wrote 2 autobiographies. He wrote a musical. He wrote so many different types of genres. And I think that's really interesting too, to think about how Langston Hughes is often kind of defined based on how you, like what you read about him, right? And so I think it's really important. And it's why I also, while we'll talk about a manifesto and poetry today, I also shared some of the best of simple stories that I scanned in and sent you guys, some ones that I like to teach in my own class because they're very short and accessible, but they have a lot going on and what they're discussing. And I'd like my students to just kind of see the variety of Langston Hughes's work and also kind of the time period in which he's writing, because he's writing really basically from the 20s until the 60s, right? And it's a vast amount of work. Another important thing is that he considers himself a writer of the working class. And that's really important because he wanted his work to be accessible, right? He wrote in ways, his poetry in many ways is more, students feel like they get it better, because he's not trying to kind of hide everything in very flowery language per se. There's definitely complex and very image heavy and figurative language heavy poems that he has. But he's also really trying to write for people that he kind of considers the lowdown folks. And he often used jazz, the blues as styles that really impacted him, right? And so you can see a lot of his poems also have that kind of blues or jazz style. And while we're much more used to thinking of that in a really artistic way, at the time it was not considered to be so. It was considered to be kind of like very kind of lower end, not particularly artistic. And so he's really popularized the idea of seeing the jazz and the blues and spirituals as art, alongside with people like Paul Robeson, for example. But he also was a writer of the working class because he was sympathetic with communism and with socialism in particular. While he was never part of the Communist Party or anything, he was very sympathetic with socialism. And so there's a lot of poems that he has in which he really wants us to think about how we can make the world better, right? How we can try to make, to write about things that matter, as opposed to just write about things that are just beautiful for beauty's sake. Right. And it's important too, because he's growing up, he's writing in the time of the Red Scare, right? That we can see that a lot of his poems as he got older had a lot more socialist focus. But that even in Call to Creation, we can kind of see that as well, the poem we'll talk about later. But it was something that he had to really struggle with, that there was a lot of censorship. The Red Scare led to censorship, blacklisting. It led to court cases. W.E.B. Du Bois, who's probably one of the most famous intellectuals of, you know, kind of this, of the similar period. He was actually taken to court under the idea that he was a spy for Russia. There was absolutely no evidence to the fact, and he was found not guilty. But it did destroy his career, and many men of color got their careers destroyed by the idea that they were kind of persecuted by the government for having not having capitalist beliefs, right? And so this is something that's really important too when we think about a lot of the Harlem Renaissance, is that there were people who had these socialist beliefs, there were conservatives and more kind of capitalist writers, but there was a lot of diversity in it, right? This is not, he's just one person in a larger Harlem Renaissance, right? So moving on. So like I said, he wrote in a variety of genres. I'm going to talk about two. I'm going to talk about the manifesto that he wrote that's well known, called The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, as well as in the kind of workshop or text section that we'll talk about two poems, Formula and Call to Creation. So to start with, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain was published in The Nation in 1926. When I teach this, I usually also have my students read the original thing that he was responding to, because while it's published in June of 1926, it's responding to George Schuyler's the Negro Art Hokum, which was published the week before in the same publication. What's interesting about this is George Schuyler is probably well known as one of the kind of most famous Black conservatives of the time. He wrote a very excellent book called Black No More. That's like a satire of a lot of satire of a lot of things, but very interesting book. But he wrote this original manifesto that said that there's no such thing as Black art, that Black art is just American art, that Black Americans experience the same things as white Americans, so they don't write anything different, and that they basically, since they're also educated in a European manner, that means they never really could make an art that's any different from white European descended people, right? So that was his argument, that it was hokum, that there could even be Black art. Hughes at this time was still early in his career, right? As I told you, he was 19 when he did his first poem, but he was actually still in college. He had had some years in between, but he was attending college when he published this manifesto. He had just recently published his first book of poetry called The Weary Blues. And in fact, this was one that was very focused on kind of using blues as the foundation of his poetics. And so by writing a manifesto, right, he was writing a document of an ideology crafted to convince and convert. And I think that's a really great definition of manifesto, because it's something that's not just about being persuasive. It's trying to like get people onto your side. It's even a document that can be provocative or polemical, right? Something that isn't always about convincing you, but about making you like want to be part of the conversation, right? And so I wanted to explain a little bit more about the manifesto genre, because I think it's important, if you wanted to teach this, to kind of talk to your students about that this is a genre with a long history in the United States, right? A manifesto is a form of nonfiction. It's a public declaration, right? Publishing it in newspapers clearly makes it public, right? Which points out an issue in society and puts forward a solution to that issue, right? We often think of them in very political ways, that they're just about politics, the Communist Manifesto being probably the most famous example. But there have been many important art manifestos. In fact, there's so many art manifestos, usually quite experimental, about what art should do, what relationship art should have with politics or the community, right? There's so many different questions it asks, but there have been a lot of important art manifestos. In fact, America itself kind of, the first American text is the Declaration of Independence, and this list of grievances that is a manifesto, right? Which identifies problems or complaints that a group has against another group and the proposed solution, right? So in many ways, the manifesto is the most American of genres, right? It's something that kind of is the beginning of our when we're created, we create this list of grievances, this manifesto of what's been done wrong and how we can solve it by becoming independent. Art manifestos also kind of have these big declarations, but they also tend to play with language, engage with other ideas and definitions of art, and put forth important questions to the art community. So art manifestos answer questions like, what is the purpose of art? Or what is the role of the artist in society? Or how can art affect the society at large? Right. And so these are the types of things that if you were going to put this to your students, you might think like, let's talk about what a manifesto does. Let's talk about what kind of questions this manifesto might be answering. Right. So for me, these are some of the key points that I talk about when I'm teaching this to my students. Again, I talk about the manifesto genre and its role in art, which we just kind of did, right? The manifesto itself is really concerned with issues of class, race, and art, right? It's not just about being Black, but actually, if you've read it already, I shared it ahead of time, that like it's also about like middle class, upper class versus lower class Black people and what they think about art. Another question, obviously, the title is The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. So like, what is the racial mountain, right? That's something that's definitely important to talk about with students. What does American mean and what does Black mean, right? This is something that's very important as well, right? When we're thinking about the Negro artist and the racial mountain, what does it say about creating a Black art, and where does that Black art fit into an American tradition of art? And then also it asks kind of what were the values of the artistic movement within the Harlem Renaissance, right? Like this is a major important part of it, is to think of when we read this document, we get some sense of what at least one perspective was on what kind of values the Harlem Renaissance held. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. Okay. So when I start with teaching this, I like to kind of first start with the fact that like a manifesto kind of has to hook you in and needs to start with something, all writing has to hook you in a certain sense, right? It needs to start with something. And I like to kind of talk to students about, like, I like to put on the screen these first few lines of the manifesto. What I usually like to do too, and we can talk about this more in class, is I allow them to use the annotate tool in Zoom. And what they can do with that is I ask them to just circle or highlight or write very like a couple words of like what is something that really stuck out to them, right, while they were reading. So if they're using like the highlight tool, this tool or something, they might circle. Obviously, I thought I was using a different tool, but the spotlight tool is what I thought it was. I can have them, put a little arrow around something and be like, this is something that really matters to me, or I want to talk about. And so sometimes I like to put up a block quote so that we can start from there. I'll clear all of this now. So this hook is like one of the most promising of the young Negro poets said to me once, I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet, meaning I believe I want to write like a white poet, meaning subconsciously I would like to be a white poet, meaning behind that I would like to be white. And I was sorry the young man said that, for no great poet has ever been afraid of being himself. And I doubted then that, with his desire to run away spiritually from his race, this boy would ever be a great poet, right? And so this is the hook that we start with. We get this kind of anecdote. I've, heard from a promising Black poet this thing once. And I'm going to break down to you what I think he's actually saying through this, right? So it's engaging with a text that or a story that we're not familiar with, but it wants to like use that anecdote to say like, when somebody says they don't want to be a Black poet, what they really mean is they want to be white, right? And he interrogates that and he wants to kind of prove that to you, right? Certainly that could be very polemical, like, well, maybe he just wants to be a poet. Like, what does that mean? It doesn't mean he hates being Black, right? There's a way in which we could get very angry or defensive about this. And that's what a manifesto wants you to do, is it wants you to engage, right? It wants you to be like a little provoked, right? And so this line does that. That anecdote can really provoke a discussion or wants to really make you be part of the conversation, right? So when we have that, sorry. Oh. So the context then that I always give them after we kind of talk about this hook and like, wow, like we're really provoked, like, look at all of us, we kind of agree or disagree with this context. Is that the young Negro poet that he's talking about is County Cullen. County Cullen is a very also important Harlem Renaissance figure. He died actually quite young, right at the end of the Harlem Renaissance. His most famous poem is probably called Yet Do I Marvel. And it's kind of put forward as an example of a poem that has this kind of consciously thinking about Blackness and how Blackness and art are seen as mutually exclusive. There's a lot of ways to read it. Some people really misread it as him being sad that he was born Black. I don't think that that's the best way to interpret the poem, but it's certainly one way that people have interpreted it. And so he's a very famous poet, and he has a much more traditional style, right, than Langston Hughes does. And if you ever read his poems, they're rhyme. They're much more they're more like reading a Phyllis Wheatley poem, right? And she wrote very traditionally as well. So the quote that they're talking about that is from this anecdote is from the Brooklyn Eagle. And in 1924, County Cullen said, "If I'm going to be a poet at all, I'm going to be a poet, not Negro poet. This is what has hindered the development of artists among us. Their one note has been the concern with their race. That is all very well. None of us can get away from it. I cannot at times. You will see it in my verse. The consciousness of this is too poignant at times. I cannot escape it. But what I mean is this. I shall not write of Negro subjects for the purpose of propaganda. That is not what a poet is concerned with. Of course, when the emotion rising out of the fact that I am a Negro is strong, I express it. But that is another matter." Right? So this is like the kind of quote that he's talking about. Right. And I think it's helpful for us to think about, we could compare, right? Like, what did County Cullen say? How does Langston Hughes interpret it? Right. The fact that he kind of thinks about writing of Black subjects as a kind of propaganda, I like to talk about, what does propaganda mean, right? Propaganda often has a very negative kind of connotation, right? That it's something that's manipulative, deceitful. It's not telling the entire truth. In certain time periods, that hasn't been the case. In certain countries, it still isn't considered a negative word. But for us, when you use that, it's a very loaded word, right? And it says something about how he thinks that if you write about Black subjects, right, and what does that even mean? What's a Black subject, right? That it's always has a political purpose. It has some ulterior motive, right? And that he would prefer to not have that, right? So I think it's really interesting for us to think about the fact that Hughes is talking about this, right? He's in conversation with other figures in the Harlem Renaissance. So not only is he answering against George Schuyler, who's written the Negro Art Hokum, he's also answering against County Cullen, right? Who is saying this quote, right, in the Brooklyn Eagle. And so I think that's always important for us to talk about. When I talk about, then when I ask them, right, after we get everything through and we're like, okay, this is the context, let's think about how he's provoked us. I ask them, what is the racial mountain, right? And this can lead to a lot of different answers. This is usually what I point them to, that the racial mountain, right? And think of that image, right? This idea of like some sort of obstacle, a thing that you have to climb over to get over, something that makes it hard to see maybe across from. It leaves you blind to something else. It makes it, there's an unknown outside of it, right? And that it's a mountain that's kind of either caused by race, that it's a mountain that must deal explicitly with race, that it's racialized, or that it's something that is made racial, right? This is something that's really interesting. For me, the definition that I put out to them is that the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America, right, this obstacle, is threefold. One, the urge within the race toward whiteness. Two, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization. And three, to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. So with these three ideas, we have the race towards whiteness, or the idea of anti-blackness, right? That there is within the culture this desire to be physically and culturally white, right? That there's, whether it's trying to kind of get lighter skin, trying to pass as white, there's a long history of that. In fact, there's an excellent short novella called Passing by Nella Larson that's kind of about this whole phenomenon. Also a Harlem Renaissance novel, like I said. The other thing about American standardization, that everybody wants to have the same style, that experimentation and is not rewarded, right? That assimilation and homogeneity is the American way, right? The people want you to be, that you have to be a certain way to be American. And that also you should be as little Negro as possible and as much American as possible, right? And that we talk about too, like, what is the implication of this word? If we're saying that there's Negro and there's American, right? There's Black and there's American. Isn't that suggesting that American is kind of not, that Black people are not part of America, right? That there's frequently people will say that when they want to talk about being American, they might really just mean white, right? And so it's very important for us to think about like this question of like, okay, who is included in the term American, who gets counted as foreign or outsider, right? Especially when it comes to art. And we think about that too when it comes to the reason why things like African-American literature classes and things were found, was because of the fact that if you try to take an American literature class, you weren't going to read any Black people, right? And so that now, while we have these other classes that are separate, there's more people who read them in American literature classes, but that there's still this kind of domination of white Americans being kind of put forward as the kind of standard American experience. Class is also another really important part of the racial mountain, right? The middle class, for him, he denigrates the middle class and the upper class. In the manifesto, he talks about the middle class as people who are by no means rich, yet never uncomfortable nor hungry, smug, contented, respectable folk, members of the Baptist church, right? So these are people who don't really know what it's like to struggle, and they look down on other people, right? And they're respectable, right? This idea of respectability politics is very important in both of these classes. The upper class, it's for racial culture, the home of self-styled high-class Negro, has nothing better to offer. Instead, there will be perhaps more aping of things white than in a less cultured or less wealthy home. And we can see here that he even thinks that upper class Black people basically try to be white. And he even uses the term aping, right? This is a kind of very negative connotation, right? The idea of something less than trying to pretend to be more than, right? And so that is a really important thing too, that he sees the upper class and the middle class as a place that has no real space for Black art. But the lower class, right, the low down folks, as he put them, they are the majority. And he says, may the Lord be praised, right? They furnish a wealth of colorful, distinctive material for any artist because they still hold their own individuality in the face of American standardization, right? So here he's trying to say, like, if we want a Black art, we have to go to the lower classes. We have to go to the culture of people who are in the lower class, that they have the kind of wealth of material that's distinctive and that doesn't apologize and that doesn't try to assimilate, right? This is for him is where, so the racial mountain can only be scaled if we adopt and we celebrate the lower class within Black culture, right? So ultimately then, what should Black American art value? According to this manifesto, what is unique to Blackness, right? The jazz, blues, spirituals. These are the types of things that should be part of Negro art, right? In his opinion. Freedom and racial pride, right? He is really clear about the fact that it's not about the approval of white gatekeepers or of middle upper class Black people. He has a really interesting paragraph when he talks about if you're a Black artist, you have to try to, one, navigate the respectability politics of people who say, oh no, don't portray us that way. That will make us look bad. That makes the culture look bad. And white gatekeepers who want him to traffic in stereotypes and traffic in the type of minstrelsy that has kept Black people down for so long, right? So he's in this kind of bind between trying to hold to white standards, but also trying to hold to the respectability politics that have been made for good reason to try to escape oppression and other things, but that hold him down as an artist. And then lastly, what he really wants Black art to value is the full humanity of Black people, right? And this is why he's so concerned with the white gatekeepers and the middle or upper class Black people, because what they do is they want to either have a stereotype of Blackness or they want to have a perfect version of Blackness. They don't want the Black person to look bad because there's already so much in culture and society that makes them look bad. But because of that, they can't be full round characters or full round people, right? And his line, "We know we are beautiful and ugly too," is really important to showing, right? This idea that it's important that if we're going to show Black people and Black art, that Black art would show the full humanity of Black people, that it would show Black people as heroes, but also as villains, right? As people who are doing the right thing and people who do the wrong thing, right? And that this is a very important part of Black art. As I conclude, I just wanted to also know, like I said, I gave you the Jesse B. Simple stories, or the simple stories as they're called. I really like to teach Banquet in Honor alongside the Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain. It's a really funny story about how Langston Hughes believes, and he talks about it in this manifesto, that Black artists are not appreciated by the Black community until white people appreciate them. And so it's really kind of a banquet in which the speaker ends up really like, giving it to the audience as like, why did you never support my work before? Why did you never do this? And so it's a really nice pairing, and you can kind of see a short story that has a similar message to the Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain, and it is included in the simple short stories I gave you. And also I'll share this PowerPoint with you, and you should feel free to use it in your classroom with whatever changes you want to make to it. That there's also audio of some of the stories that are narrated by Ossie Davis if you wanted to kind of have students listen to the stories. But those, I like them because they pair well with this kind of manifesto of like what Black art should do, right? So I wanted to make sure that I stuck to time, and it looks like it's